Okay, and I will start sharing my screen. And there we go. It worked. So people are seeing bridging the gap between Division 3 and Division 9. And today's discussion.
So let me just interject right away. I'm going to ask a few questions along the way just to get the back and forth. Bring your technical feet back down to earth, as I like to say, because you are a technical thinker, and the audience that won't necessarily immediately understand some of the content. So we'll try and keep it simple. But for everybody else, if you just save your questions for the end and type them into the Zoom bubble, then we'll be able to answer them later on. Sorry.
Yeah, and unlike the first session, I'm probably going to challenge a few of those long-held beliefs, and some people may agree, some people may disagree, but quite honestly, whatever it is we're doing right now isn't working. So at the very least, we can try something new. I apologize in advance too, because we're talking about the new spec, and of course, specs don't come with a lot of pictures, so you'll see a lot of words up on the screen. I'll just ask, don't try to read them. If you want to go back and revisit the presentation, please do. But really, the idea here is just to present ideas and strike up the conversation.
It's the power of the recorded video. You can freeze the frame and read the content when you go back to it. You don't need to do that today.
Yeah, so today's discussion, basically, we're going to enter into identifying a few of the opportunities. The big thing here is about cooperative risk management, spreading risk out amongst all the people that can actually manage the risk versus just telling people that, hey, you're handling it. Also looking at discussion events, also integrating the specification, coordinating the events, how we have to describe the work. And most important, and you'll hear me say this a couple times today, the spec doesn't write to trade scope, but the spec has to understand trade scope in order to fulfill or fill in all of the gaps that actually occur between the different trades. And most importantly, at the very end, we'll have that implementing the new spec, a case study. In this particular case, it would have been could have, should have, would have. If we had done things different 2 years ago, we might not have been in the problems we are today. So starting off right at the very beginning, people read these specs and they go related requirements. Okay, well, whatever, that doesn't belong to me. But in the case of the spec that we prepared for the NFCA, we've tried to make it as interactive as possible. Lots of spec notes telling you what you need to do, including little handy little links, the green lettering there that will actually connect you to the NFCA floor covering reference manual online if you have a paid subscription, so that you can actually use the specs that are actually available through the NFCA for your use.
If you do that, I guess you could say that you can cut and paste and it doesn't bother us at that point. It's a healthy cut and paste, right?
It's a healthy cut and paste. Yeah, that's the right kind of cut and paste versus copying the old project forwards. You're at least starting with fresh content. So the related requirements, these are the conversation starters. These are the things, particularly with the architects, the interior designers, and the engineers in the audience. We don't talk enough. You know, concrete is left up to the engineer, finishes are left up to the designer, and nobody coordinates the work. But when we're installing rigid materials, fragile materials like stone and large format porcelain tiles, we need to have a stiffer floor. Or, you know, if we're putting down resilient flooring, we need to have a floor that doesn't curl as much so that we're holding the floor to a flatter profile. There's ways to accomplish that in engineering, and speaking and involving the engineer early in the design process about the kinds of finishes is a good idea. It also helps the specifier when they're trying to work between spec sections. So the related requirements in the NFCA master are quite extensive, and that's so that basically you're not going to forget what you need to coordinate. It's also important for trade work, because the only way the trades can actually figure out what somebody else needs is to actually read what's in those contents. It's not all about your individual little section. So even if early engagement isn't possible, like one of the things I like to say is this also gives you your opportunity to phone a friend, right? Your expert in the field, your trusted advisor. So there's nothing wrong with a spec writer calling up the, you know, a distributor or an installer and saying, what would you do in this situation? And how would I write about that? You build up those relationships, and the list of related requirements is a very good way to do that.
So if I'm a floor trade bidding on a job and I'm in the section 096500 for resilient, and I'm seeing the general and the products and the execution sections, I'm going to see related requirements in the general section.
Yes, correct. Every single specification section should have a list of related requirements.
I'm going to go there to see what is related to my work, and I'm probably going to see concrete or something else that's going to say, pay attention to that. It's going to affect what you do when you show up on site.
Or in this case, in 096500, you're going to see a direct reference to the new spec section, right? It says, go here to coordinate. So, yeah. The big thing that we're all about, of course, is managing cost risk. Cost to the contractor, cost to the owner, cost to the consultant, cost to the trades. And I use the words constructor and trades. It's different than the way the industry typically uses those terms. I use the terms from a contractual basis, not a self-naming thing. So constructor, that would be like your general contractor, your prime contractor. The trade is what you call the floor covering contractor or the concrete finishing contractor. I just call them trades.
I think the official word is floor covering installer is our trade.
Floor covering installer is your trade, correct. So we created in the new section a component called price and payment procedures. This was to align what we had a lot of questions from the last session. How do I price what I don't know? So a cash allowance means we have a known unknown. The floor is going to change. The floor is going to need some modification. The floor will have some material applied to it or taken away from it, but we don't know what the exact quantity is. Concrete's a natural material. It deflects, all depending on how you look after it, the day the concrete was placed, what the mix design is. So what we're trying to do now is establish costs to manage the work as early in the project as possible. So it's really asking that the trades to submit unit prices for adjustment of costs up or down based on a known quantity, and the quantity is given by the consultant, that's the architect, engineer, or interior designer, based on their understanding that there's going to be some remedial projects required to adjust the concrete to meet the floor installer's requirements.
And it will be specifically allocated for that purpose to,
correct.
What we're talking about here is filling the gap, so that you can't have something else go wrong with construction and they just dip into that cash allowance so that it's no longer left when it's actually needed because someone else has used it.
Yeah, and the goal here is to make those costs transparent to the owner. The owner is paying for this. It's like anybody, you know, like you don't want to have your cable installed and find out that you have to pay for all the servicing costs on your street. You expect to pay for whatever it is on your bill. If you want an extra, they will tell you what that extra component is, you know, the new remote control or the security system. And they just set that up for you and tell you what that cost is going to be. And that's really what owners are about. This is also an important message to the consultants in the audience. Discuss unit price allowances with your clients.
It's interesting doing it this way, Keith, is better, because if you plan to get competitive pricing, you're going to get more competitive pricing. But if you don't plan for this and you have to react, suddenly you need 1,000 bags of floor leveling material and a grinder on site, and you need it like yesterday. It's going to cost you 3 times the price because it's all reactive.
Yeah, you have to order materials 8 weeks in advance if you want to get it tomorrow. It's going to be some extra delivery charges for sure. Or it just might not be available. You might have to get something that in fact you don't want, but it'll make do for the time.
Yeah.
And from all industry feedback we get, a unit price allowance fairly manages the tolerance compatibility, assigns risk to the individuals who have the most control over those costs. And strangely enough, the American Concrete Institute actually has a guide for tolerance, compatibility, and concrete construction. And they actually say, you know what, architect, engineer, here's 3 steps to follow. Gather your information, evaluate it, put it in your documents, tell people what you need. And oh, by the way, you can identify it as a cash allowance. This is a little paragraph that is referenced from ACI, the American Concrete Institute, back to the American Society of Concrete Contractors who actually finish concrete.
So this is a normal practice. This is not anything unusual because of the type of problem we're talking about here, this gap.
Correct. It's been around for 20 years as a suggested method for managing tolerance compatibility.
Part of a building cost.
Yeah. So it's really simple. What we're looking at as far as managing cost is the solid blue line kind of indicates the typical surface profile for floor flatness, floor levelness, greatly exaggerated so you can see the wobbles. Then we have this dashed blue line, which is talking about the kind of corrections required before the floor covering trade ends up on site, the floor installer. The red line, which represents that straight edge measurement where basically the floor installer is going to do the final floor prep. And of course, if you have an owner that is wanting a super flat floor, the gray line indicates something else that you can do by putting down self-leveling toppings.
So it's interesting to note that the trade scope of work for the floor covering installer doesn't include getting the blue solid line to the standard of the blue dotted line. That is outside of the trade scope of work for floor coverers. So there is an extra, or someone else needs to do that work. But that would be, you know, if you get the blue line, if you show up on site and you get the blue line, you're going to reject the slab.
Yeah, and yet it actually probably met the performance requirement for the concrete person.
Right.
In fact, that dashed line, we're going to focus on that. That was the big aha moment for us. That is a scope gap.
That was delivered in January, but then it changed in February, March, April, May, June into the solid blue line because that's just what concrete does.
Concrete will change. The other thing about managing risk is managing relative humidity and alkalinity. When the alkaline salts on the surface of concrete get moist, it breaks down the adhesive. So if you want to rush installation of flooring, there's also got to be a recognition of that and cash allowance for inclusion of a moisture barrier surface applied to the concrete. One of those, wet fingers in the wind kind of measurements. It takes, if you have a 100 mm slab, the slab will dry out at a rate of about 1 mm per day. So that 4-inch thick slab will take about 100 days to dry, provided you have good curing conditions. If you have no temporary heat and you put down the concrete in September and it stays cold and wet for 6 months during winter, it's still wet in the spring.
And it is the alkalinity that's present in the moisture that is eating up the adhesive.
Yeah. So one of the big things that affects flooring installation is rushing to completion, placing concrete in wet weather, adding water to the concrete mix that hasn't been scheduled. It's a little something called latence. People overwork the surface. They put the concrete floats on the concrete while there's still water present, which gives you that crazing pattern. There's specifications that call for a hard struck finish, which makes the concrete surface too dense to actually adhere things to. If we install during cold weather, if it's snowing, if it's raining, you get. Hello, could you mute yourself, please? There we go. I'll mute you for you. So all these things can break down the surface. So you need a cash allowance for adjustment of the surface as well. By the way, excessive latence, like what you're seeing in a lot of these shots, is actually considered a construction deficiency and not a floor preparation requirement. And as Chris said, the cash allowance does not, it better not, include for correction of deficiencies caused by construction processes and scheduling. Um, yeah, when I joined the team, as Chris pointed out, the big problem that we had was words flat, level, even, smooth were being used interchangeably for different things. And what we found was that the way the words were being used, the same word was being used differently between the concrete trade and the flooring trades, floor covering trades. So same words have different meanings when read by different people. You know, the maximum floor straight edge tolerance requirement for floor covering from many manufacturers is 5 millimeters and 3 millimeters. Some of those things can get down to 1.5 or 3 millimeters, or 2 millimeters and 3 meters. In this first picture, this is a floor that is level, as in it doesn't have tilt, but it's not very smooth. In fact, by any stretch of the imagination, this floor would not meet any surface tolerance. But it does show the misunderstandings about what it takes to make a floor correct for the floor covering installer. So these troughs were actually measured, they're within 5 millimeters and 3 meters, but because of the number of troughs, it wouldn't have satisfied the concrete finishing requirement to start with. We have a second picture. This is actually a very smooth floor, but it's not very flat in the sense that this is a 3 meter straight edge and there's a 10 millimeter gap that requires correction. So in this particular case, this concrete slab actually met the concrete performance requirement, but is still not acceptable for the floor covering installer.
Keith, I think it's important to qualify smooth. Exactly what is smooth trying to say? For the floor coverer, it's directly relative to CSP, which is texture in the surface.
Yeah, so CSP is concrete surface profile, and it actually needs to have a little bit of grit to it. It needs like fine sandpaper.
So you can have that sort of chattery look on the left and it still be smooth.
From a floor covering perspective, except for those
apart from little lumps and like, you know, smooth is the difference. Very smooth would be 100 grit sandpaper or 1,000 grit sandpaper. Less smooth would be 60 grit or 40 grit sandpaper. That's what it's trying to point out for us.
Yeah, and that's so we can get mechanical on. Yeah.
Are you comparing your flatness to ASTM 710? Level flat within?
Level and flat within. Sorry, let me just back up here. Yeah, so there are a couple of standards. The concrete flat and level, of course, is measured to ASTM E1155. So then there's an ASTM F710 that talks about floor preparation for resilient flooring, and it talks about FFFL, but it also says that you need to have correction made to that concrete slab to bring it into surface tolerances required by resilient floor covering manufacturers. So we're moving towards that interpretation for F710. In fact, you hit the nail on the button. All the things we're driving towards for floor preparation are to meet F710 once the concrete standard is established under the E1155.
Yeah, don't lean on E1155 to satisfy the floor cover. It does not do that. ASTM E1155 to shortcomings.
Yeah. And keep in mind that whatever the concrete was measured at on day 3, even if it met a floor covering tolerance of say 5 millimeters or 3 millimeters and 3 meters, 6 months from now, it will not meet that tolerance. It will change. So again, this is about different interpretations of the same word. For division 3, if the contractor, constructor was to ask division 3, hey, did you include for underlayment? And the trade could answer no, if self-leveling underlayment was not specified in division 3. So a contractor goes to the division 9 trade and says, hey, did you include for underlayment? And the trade says, well, sure I did. I do that all the time, because they are referring to smoothing underlayment, which is trowel applied, not poured and settled on the surface of the slab. And many times,
skim
because,
coat.
go ahead.
A skim coat or a scratch coat?
Skim coat or a scratch coat. The fact that it's called under limit because it happens underneath the floor covering is really the only common thing that happens here. But in this case, the whole goal of the scratch coat or that smoothing coat is to follow the contours of the slab. It goes from feather edge to maybe 1 millimeter in thickness. That stuff they're pouring on the slab on the left, that's got to be 3 millimeters, maybe up to 65 or more, depending on how much correction needs to be made to that floor slab. So the one thing to remember is concrete, the division looks after flattening and leveling of the concrete. Division 9 does not flatten or level anything on concrete. It just makes the surface acceptable for installation of the resilient flooring. It's minimal work.
And that's driven by trade scope of work, which is sort of attached to the Red Seal training program and the whole trade training practices, which we'll talk about in a minute, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of comes down to also there's management compatibility. Two big words here: concrete quantitative tolerance for the concrete people, floor covering qualitative requirements, and you can see here in the writing E1155 and ASTM S710. They're broken out two different things. So when we're managing tolerance, this is what the concrete people do. Very exact, repeatable, laid out on lines that can be repeated. It uses highly technical measuring devices, and it actually recognizes that this floor has a profile and local deviation. There's a lot of things about concrete, because it's a natural material, that it's never going to come out exactly smooth and straight as we would draw a line across a piece of paper. The other thing that we specifiers have been guilty of over the last few years is increasing the level of flatness on the floor to try to address a lot of those tolerance issues, because we weren't informed about the problem. So we've been putting out specs that say, no, you need an FF35 or an FF50, which is, a equivalent to 3 millimeters in 3 meters. But keeping in mind that because concrete changes, the tighter the tolerance for the concrete on that day 3 measurement, the more it will change over time, meaning that your FF50 could change up to 70% by the time the floor installer is on site, which means you could have something like an FF15 or an FF12 when it actually comes time to install your floor. So pushing up the tolerance doesn't solve the problem. In fact, it creates a lot of extra work for the concrete people, a lot of extra expense to the owner. You're probably better off just specifying manageable tolerances like FF25 to FF30 for slabs on grade, perhaps FF20 to FF25 for suspended slabs. No levelness on suspended slabs because they deflect and they always have slope to some degree. So managing tolerances for Division 9, it's all about the hand tools, right? So you put down your 3 meter straight edge, you have a wedge that fits underneath, which then you can just read off the number on top, 3 millimeters, 5 millimeters, 10 millimeters, whatever that gap tolerance is. It's placed across the high points of the concrete and fairly evenly dispersed across the entire slab. It's a continuous process. And that's the gaps, the high points and the very low points are the components that need to be corrected. And then the flooring trade comes back and fills in the remaining with the skim coats and scratch coats. One of the things that's very easy, another way to measure this floor, and it's easy to achieve, is point cloud survey. Point cloud surveys are done with a 3D laser scanner, and it outputs information in many different ways. In this case, it's showing up as a thermal map of high points and low points. Very easy to visualize how much work needs to be done on the floor. It can also be established on a grid, or it can be overlaid on photographs of the floor so that you can actually see like isobars like you would see on a weather map. Here it is, the Red Seal occupational standard for apprenticeship training for concrete finishing. It's recognized all across Canada. They call it different things in different places. Some of the unions also include the word cement mason. To me, it's a concrete finisher. Different places have different words. It still comes down to we're dealing with that work to achieve.
It's interesting. Cement is not concrete yet. They're called a cement finisher. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think in Quebec, because béton kind of means cement concrete, it's not as well defined. But it's interesting in Ontario that they call it cement brackets concrete, because everybody talks about cement sidewalks or these cement swimming pools. So yeah, again, it kind of plays up to colloquial language. But this is the telling part. You read, as I say, the specifier should be aware of trade scope. We don't dictate it, but we should be aware of it. And one of the things that comes out is master format lists concrete finishing as a single number. There are some other things under there for pattern concretes and decorative concrete finishes for concrete finishing, but there's really only one section number, and it doesn't do the complexity of this work justice. As I said, we've identified the scope gap, and actually speaking with Concrete Canada, they've broken it out to two definite different types of concrete finishing. So the first one, as Concrete Canada calls it, these are the people that work with the concrete finishers, is wet finishing. So because I actually helped create master format content, I said, great, I'll create a new number. Section 033511, concrete floor wet finishing. It's not a name that's been accepted, so the name might change. People might not like it. Sorry, just a moment. Somebody trying to sell me duct cleaning services. Obviously, it's more important than this meeting. Sorry about that. So yeah, concrete floor wet finishing, and it's very easy to define. They perform site preparation, they place and level the concrete, they finish the plastic concrete, they have specific knowledge about concrete mix design, and they absolutely understand how weather conditions affect pouring, placing, leveling, setting, and finishing of that concrete work.
Just for everybody, define plastic concrete.
Yeah, plastic concrete, that is the concrete that comes out of the ready mix truck. You know, it's structural concrete that gets placed onto concrete, you know, to create the concrete slab. It's, we call it plastic because it can be pushed around.
As opposed to hard concrete, which,
yeah, you have to bring out the jackhammers to erase it.
Yep.
Yeah. So that comes back to, you know, just kind of a pictorial.
Typically what we think of when we're finishing concrete. Wet
Exactly.
finishing.
So you see reinforcing steel that they've got to place around, they use tools, they use concrete floats. If there's any concrete people on the project, if you really want to make the floor flooring covering installers' lives happy, don't use a bowl float, use a highway screed. You know, anything that we can do to cut off the high points in the concrete, the happier everybody will be later on as the project opens up. But basically what we're looking at here is wet concrete finishing. They coordinate the supply. They look at quality testing at the point of discharge. They coordinate the subgrade preparation. They coordinate with formwork and reinforcing steel so that when they place the concrete, everything ends up in the right location. They put in place all of the embeds, the plates and the pre-manufactured expansion joints. They coordinate placement of mechanical and electrical services, particularly those things that have to be placed so that they're at the level of the same level as floor coverings. A lot of times floor covering is actually installed, like for instance, in an access hatch so that you don't see the access hatch. But it doesn't do much good if the access hatch is set too low or too high, because now you've got a different kind of bump in the middle of your floor that you can't correct. They also saw cut in the contraction joints. They also fill those with particular sealants. Something else to coordinate if there are sealants that are not compatible with flooring materials, be a good time to raise that point. And they also coordinate with the next trade. This is the aha moment. Everybody should have this as new knowledge. This is the dry finishing trade. This is still concrete finishing, but this is what happens when the concrete is technically dry.
I've been calling this trade the concrete correction trade for too long. I'm doing a disservice to the world of concrete because there's nothing to correct. They've done their job.
Correct.
So this dry finishing term is powerful. It's we needed to know this a long time ago.
Yeah. Now, this is not to say that they don't work with wet materials, because they also, this is the same trade that applies those self-leveling underlayments. They do a lot of wet work, but it's not a part of that structural slab. So
these folks are using grinders and pouring hydraulic cement underlayment. That's, I guess we've got a few members within FCA who specialize in this. They sort of see themselves as a trade on their own.
Yeah, as a specialization. The concrete finishing occupational standard actually sees these as specialized components of the same trade.
Yeah.
So you're either a heart surgeon or you're a kidney surgeon kind of thing. Yeah. You're very seldom a surgeon for doing both. But in this case, you can see this is the guy going around with this grinding machine. He's doing some bump grinding to knock off the high points. And then you got a guy that goes in and basically trowels in the low points. And typically the spec is going to call for cutting out an even edge, and grinding out the bottom of that. So you got a profile. So whatever patch you put in there is going to be held in mechanically as well as adhered. So they use grout in those locations. And then they, of course, strike off to the edge of whatever that saw cut, bird bath correction that they do. So these guys, they correct wet finish concrete by grinding and filling. And I think the word correction is appropriate, Chris, because it's not a repair. It's really preparing the floor ready for other things. It's correcting the compatibility of the tolerances.
It's not necessarily speaking to shortcomings in the work.
Correct. They would also be responsible for scarifying or abrading the surface. That would be shot blasting or scabbling or something like that, so that we get that nice surface texture that we're looking for, the mechanical bond. And so they achieve that concrete surface profile that the floor people need.
Is it fair to say the wet finishes do not see themselves as dry finishes?
Yeah, typically they have their own sets of tools, completely different toolkit, totally different experience. They're dealing with, those guys, they're called out, they work very long hours. They're called out rain, wind, shine, snow, sleet, hail. These guys tend to be a little bit more enclosed.
Yeah. So the wet finishes do their job in January, they issue their invoice, and they are not expecting to come back to become dry finishes.
Correct. They're done, dusted as it was.
Yeah.
So here you can see
this corrective action is to meet the standard set, though.
This is to meet
right?
the standard set, correct.
Yeah.
So this is the work that we're trying to do to achieve the F710 ASTM test.
And this would not be the flooring trade's responsibility. It would be the general contractor or the concrete sub-trade's responsibility.
Yeah, it's specified in Division 3 because it is concrete finishing work. It would be, because it can now be identified in the specification, it was never identified previously because there's a lack of a description for it, basically. The general contractor would coordinate that work. They would go out and obtain prices. Whoever can do this is free. If a Division 9 guy wants to do the work, fine, but it will be specified in Division 3 concrete.
Good.
Yeah. So here you can see this guy's working with wet materials. So even though it's called dry concrete finishing, we still deal with wet materials. You can see they've gone in and they filled in the cracks with high viscosity crack sealers. These are non-moving cracks that always occur in concrete. This guy is spreading out the self-leveling underlayment. Here we're dealing with either stamped concrete or stained concrete, highly refined surface finishes. We can also, polish, give what a lot of architects are calling these days rustic terrazzo, basically grinding up the concrete surface and making that the finished surface by mechanically polishing with very fine grit diamond pads to basically create a floor finish out of the concrete itself. These guys also perform the grinding and patching to repair out of tolerance work from the wet finish concrete people. That would be a direct payment from the wet finishing people to the dry finishing people. So it's an expense to the wet finishers. And trust me, they don't want to be paying for corrections if they know what they're doing. They're going to try and get it right the first time, like almost anybody else on the job site, right? So there's also a red seal for floor covering trade practice. Again, adopted by province. As Chris pointed out, it's interesting. Some parts of the country have floor covering as 2 words, and the rest of the world, they have floor covering as a single word.
It's also
straight edge, same thing.
The Industry Training Authority out of British Columbia. I don't know about the rest of the provinces. They all have their own version of that, or some do, some don't. But there's around 100 trades on their website. Everyone from crane operator to chef to carpenter, and one of them is floor covering installer. And out of the 100 or so, there's 50 of them that come with red seal certification. One of them is floor covering installer. So there's very clear boundaries at that point drawn in as to where the floor coverers work starts and where it finishes. Work included, work not included, which really speaks to a lot of what the content you're sharing, Keith.
Yeah. And when it comes to floor prep, oh, sorry, Kim. Is that a question?
Oh, no, I didn't ask a question.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, so when it comes to floor prep for floor covering trades, I mean, I look at all of Division 9, which also includes all the resinous coatings and hard coverings, tile and things like that. But basically, from a spec writer point of view, everything is for floor prep in Division 9 is minimal and is contained in a single location. I call it 09, 05, 61, common work, floor finishes. And it covers off things like removal of existing floor coverings and accessories if you're doing a renovation job. It talks about preparing substrates, and it speaks only to scratch coats and skim coats. It's talking about removal of surface contaminants, dust and staining, so wet rinses and vacuuming, and some light sanding, because a lot of times the scratch coats and skim coats can have little bumps and humps and bubbles and things that you just want to get rid of. And that description of work is already contained in the NFCA general requirements on the NFCA manual website. Again, one of the best tools that you can purchase is to subscribe to that webpage. It is infinitely helpful. Strangely enough, master format also includes that work result. The problem is a lot of specifiers don't understand that this is actually there. They look at the material, they don't look at those common work components. But it would be very easy for almost any specifier attending this call to write a section that addresses this minimal floor prep performed by all of Division 9 floor finishing people. And once again, the floor covering trade practice. This is a picture of the website. I'm trying to remember how much it costs, Chris. It's like $400.
One time, 400. Yeah.
One time. And honestly, based on a lot of other things that specifiers pay for, I make no money off this. This is the best deal you're ever going to get.
I think there are 11 specification guides where you get to go in and just cut and paste up-to-date, accurate information, so that you don't get that ugly call on Monday morning that your spec doesn't make sense because it's 10 years old. This is
because you copied it from a project that doesn't exist anymore.
Right, and it's trying to deal with modern day products which don't operate the same like they used to back in the old days.
Yeah, so we also included a lot of stuff in the new spec about managing administration, contract administration is performed by the architect or engineer. So really we need to describe to the constructor what we need to manage our work. And it includes a lot of things, like for instance, identifying our role, the architect or the engineer, in coordinating tolerance. Again, this is from ACI. And ACI has several instances of where they've said, you know, engineer and architect should be responsible for coordinating. Compatibility, for designers are cautioned to use finish and architectural details that are compatible with the type of construction. And again, the American Society of Concrete Contractors says there's a difference between Division 3 and Division 9. You should pay attention to this. And one of the criticisms we've heard and previously in mentioning ACI is it doesn't apply in Canada. So I took a little screenshot of the various 7 or 8 chapters in Canada. And not only that, but our own CSA 823.1 that governs quality of concrete work references ACI. And anytime you have a nested standard in a standard, the standard applies in Canada. So another component that we identified in managing administration is actually calling on the contractor or the constructor to work with their quality management program. Get information from the trades about what they're going to do and how they're going to coordinate with each other. I borrowed this with permission from PCL. It was for a hospital project out on in Abbotsford, and it says exactly what needs to be done. But just like the spec, if you want quality management on a project, the quality management program should also be read. One of the key factors of the contractors, the constructors' quality management program is it really does try to tie together the different contributions of the trades that the constructor makes and the designers have, with the key being the big overlap in the middle, which is coordination.
It's just interesting when you think of general contractors, they are generally contracting out the services of experts in their field. And so there's that critical requirement that they talk, which is why we're sort of pointing out pre-construction meetings. When people actually do show up for them and talk things through, they count. Actions change. Actions change.
And even more important these days, I don't know very many larger projects these days that aren't being fast-tracked. So many times now, the floor coverings are being bid on a project 6 months after the concrete's being placed. It's too late to make any of the adjustments if you don't have those pre-construction meetings. So that's one of the big things the new spec includes. It's a what is required content for contributions from the consultant, the constructor, and the trades. The big one, which has never been specified before, is the pre-construction tolerance coordination meeting. This is not just a pre-construction meeting. This is the startup meeting for the project. So
you remind me of a pre-construction meeting that I attended with one of our inspectors on a quality assurance program job, and the general contractor was there, the architect was there, the manufacturer's rep for the flooring was there, and the floor installer was there, and the building owner was there. And the building owner was kind of grumbling, why am I here at this, why are we talking about flooring? It's way early in the process. And so he didn't seem too happy. We started up the meeting, and the first thing on the agenda was, where are you going to store the floor covering materials on site? And the general contractor said, we've got all that handled, what's next? And I said, wait, where are you going to store the materials on site? And he said, in a container, 20-foot container in the parking lot. And it was middle of summer, it was already 30 degrees by 11 o'clock. And at that point, the building owner actually said, what? That, even I know that's not right. So now I see the value in this pre-construction meeting. Please proceed. Let's figure out where we're going to store this material. I'm interested now. It was one of those moments that just was real.
Yeah, no, and then you know, there's that example, and I'm imagining there's easily 100 other examples on the same project that could have benefited. The big thing on the spec side too is managing execution. This is not taking the contractor out and shooting them. It's really about what the specification does about describing what is required to perform the work. It doesn't say how to build the work. It's not a manufacturer's instruction. Why would a spec writer, such as myself, claim to know anything more than what the manufacturer is telling you how to install? The specification is not an installation instruction. It really is about managing that quality of installed product. For me, the big thing is again on execution, and what the new spec section does. It talks about measuring the things that we need to measure to meet the final goal. So we tend to focus too much on individual trades. You get this section, Division 9, Division 3, you get this section, you go away, you read, you come back, and hopefully we can fix everything. Or the constructor's reading things, oh yeah, that costs too much, we got to get it in, we got to win the job, so lowest price. Rather than anticipating the cost for the project and managing that cost risk. So if you focus on the things you can measure, chances are you're going to control the dollars and the people much more effectively. And this is just a very quick wrap up on the case study. The partners in Dialog, the company I work at, I went to them for a case study and said, is there anything that you can provide? And they said, yes, there's this healthcare project. It's 4 stories high. It started construction late 2019. And we started placing concrete early February of 2020. And as you'll see from some of the examples coming up, within 6 weeks, we had 21 instances of out of tolerance concrete. Everything from grade beams not being placed properly to floor heights being put in the wrong locations, suspended slabs, and actually at that point, ground floor slabs that didn't even meet the floor tolerances. This wasn't for the sake of trying. The specification actually included requirements for pre-construction meetings for individual trades. It had flatness and level tolerances for the concrete, and all of the other placement and offset tolerances for attaching claddings and elevators and other things that are really important to a building to function. I'll say we were absolutely meticulous about it, but it seems that the project was meticulously not meeting any of the tolerances we had put forward. I would say that if we had this new spec ready for when the project was originally tendered in late August, September of 2019, I think most of the issues that we are currently experiencing would not have happened. So just very quickly, and you can see here I highlighted suspended slabs. This is actually off of a bill that we sent to the owner for 160 hours of additional time that took us basically to start telling the contractor how to do their work. It's not our job to tell the contractor how to do the work. We just tell them what's required. There's a number of issues that came up in this project. This is an actual recording of the actual changes. So in 6 weeks, we had 21 instances. I've blacked out names, protect the innocent and all that kind of stuff, like a good murder mystery. Here, this is the actual letter from the engineer for the project, basically saying we performed all this extra work, structural performance was not compromised. We basically accepted out of tolerance because there was no way we could correct it at that point. In the meantime, the owner was being asked to pay several millions of dollars to correct all of these out of tolerance things. So we charged $30,000. I think the cost for the concrete corrections of the repairs in that case were in excess of $3 million. And you can see his last statement: the approach to overall quality control for the remainder of the contract needs to be held into account, because we'll just keep charging more money until people get it right. This is an actual copy of one of the minutes of meeting. Cameron is the name of the engineer, and he's telling them there are problems. they're small problems, but when you put all the small problems together, they're big problems. And then the contractor responds, well, yes, we got to get back to basics. It's human error. We're not following procedures. And they actually wrote this in their own minutes. We don't have enough workers for foremen. We've increased the number of actual laborers to try to make things work better. They're saying that there were simple mistakes, not major mistakes. And oh, by the way, 2 of those mistakes were concrete mix mistakes. Everybody's responsible except the person that's supposed to be doing the coordinating, basically.
And it's now become almost impossible to fix because you're dealing with it during late stage construction.
Yeah, and
setting the ball rolling in the right direction at the beginning.
And in this particular case, the flooring installer, this was the case. The flooring installer was asked to submit bids 6 months after the concrete had started. So concrete was already bad before the flooring people actually walked on site, and the contractor basically said, the constructor said, what are you going to do to fix that? And the flooring installer basically said, till you fix the concrete, there's nothing we're going to do. So early intervention would have been an appropriate response. We couldn't stop the work. That's only something the owner can do, and they've got deadlines. Had we had that pre-installation or pre-construction tolerance meeting where everybody was at the table talking about it, and then had subsequent pre-construction meeting at each phase of the work, I don't care that the floor trades haven't been assigned yet. What it says is we need to change the way we price the project. It's got to get looked after early. And basically at that point, it's a cliche, but the stitch in time saves 9. If we had sat back and held 2 or 3 hour meeting in October of 2019, we probably wouldn't be having the problems we're having today. So I see a couple of questions coming up, but just very quickly on summary. The new spec contains clear statements about how to use the specification. Spec writers, you'll get it. There's a script in there for coordinating the different design professionals. It provides guide notes on approaches to coordinating work between divisions 3 and division 9. It also describes contributions from all the parties that affect outcomes for concrete and floor finishing. And what we've been finding is the whole section can actually be modified for other parts of the work that are also coordination dependent. Like you could coordinate division 3 with division 4 for masonry the same way, or division 3 with division 7 for curtain walls, so that you're having those same tolerance meetings, those pre-construction tolerance meetings. Sorry, people are texting me. And the best thing is there's nothing new in this section. All of the procedures that are in the new section have already been identified by different associations and institutions all across North America as acceptable ways of dealing with differential tolerances. Also, a quick reminder, we promised you on part 1 that we're going to have some deep dive sessions. Because we were preparing this session, I'm a little bit behind, but there are 4 sessions coming up: managing and coordinating tolerance compatibility, managing slab curling and deflection issues, identifying and how to actually align the compatibility between the FFFL E1155 and the F710 straight edge measurements, and most important to a specifier, how to read the project specification without falling asleep.
And these deep dive sessions will be videos, short videos loaded on the same web page as this video and other content.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep them down to 10 or 12 minutes just because I value people's times.